Peering into the dollhouse, Lily's heart pounded as she gazes at the dolls within it. They seemed to have a life of their own, moving by themselves, and even whispering to her in the night. She couldn't explain it, but she felt drawn to them, as if they had some sort of hold over her. As she played with the dolls, Lily began to feel a sense of dread. The dolls' expressions seemed to change, and their whispers grew louder and more urgent. She knew that something was terribly wrong, but she couldn't tear herself away from them. One night, as Lily slept, she was awoken by the sound of the dolls moving. She sat up in bed and saw them standing in front of her, their eyes glowing in the dark. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The next day, Lily told her neighbor, Mr. Reynolds, about what had happened. He was a retired ghost hunter who had spent his life studying the paranormal. He listened carefully to Lily's story and nodded. "I've seen this sort of thing before," he said. "It sounds like the dollhouse is cursed. There's a vengeful spirit trapped inside, and it's trying to use the dolls to communicate with you." Lily's blood ran cold as Mr. Reynolds spoke. She had never believed in ghosts or curses before, but something about the way he spoke made her believe him. With Mr. Reynolds' help, Lily began to investigate the dollhouse's secrets. She discovered that it had once belonged to a young girl who had died under mysterious circumstances. The girl's spirit had been trapped inside the dollhouse ever since, seeking revenge for the wrongs done to her. Lily knew that she had to find a way to break the curse and put the spirit to rest. She and Mr. Reynolds spent long hours researching and consulting with other experts in the paranormal field. Finally, they discovered a ritual that could break the curse. It involved a special candle, a chant, and a sacrifice of something precious. Lily knew what she had to do. She took a deep breath, lit the candle, and began to chant. She felt the spirit's presence growing stronger, but she kept going. As she finished the chant, she offered up the sacrifice. She felt a sudden rush of energy, and the dollhouse began to shake. When it was over, Lily looked around. The dolls were still there, but they were no longer moving. She could sense that the curse had been broken, and the spirit had been put to rest. However, as Lily turned to leave the room, she felt a cold hand grab her ankle. She looked down and saw the ghost of the vengeful girl, her eyes filled with rage. "You think you can just come in here and destroy my home?" the ghost hissed. "I'll never let you leave." Lily tried to scream, but the ghost's grip only grew tighter. She realized too late that the sacrifice she had offered up was not enough to appease the vengeful spirit. In a final act of desperation, Lily reached for the candle and threw it at the dollhouse, hoping to destroy it and break the curse for good. But the flame caught on something inside, and within moments, the dollhouse was engulfed in flames. Lily tried to run, but the ghost's grip was too strong. She was consumed by the fire, and the last thing she saw was the ghost of the vengeful girl, still holding onto her ankle as they both burned alive in the dollhouse. The next morning, after fire crews doused the flames, all that remained in the rubble was a perfectly preserved dollhouse within it, an additional doll with features resembling that of Lily. Story 2. The Haunted TV. John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about his new apartment. It was too quiet, too still, as if there were some sort of presence lurking just out of sight. It wasn't until he turned on the TV that he realized what was wrong. The TV seemed to turn on by itself, showing static and eerie images of a faceless figure. As the days passed, the figure began to haunt John's dreams, whispering dark secrets and urging him to join it. John tried to ignore the TV, but despite his efforts, he seemed to be entranced by it. He found himself drawn to it, watching it for hours on end, as if addicted to it. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like he was being pulled into another world. One night, as John sat in front of the TV, he heard a voice calling his name. He looked up and saw the faceless figure staring back at him from the screen. "Join me," the figure whispered. "Together we can be free." John tried to turn off the TV, but his hands wouldn't obey. He felt a sense of terror creeping up inside him, but he couldn't look away from the screen. Suddenly, the TV flickered and went black. John felt a hand on his shoulder and turned around to see the figure standing behind him. It was as if the figure had stepped out of the TV and into the real world. John tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out and touched his forehead, sending a jolt of energy through his body. John fell to the ground, unconscious. When he woke up, John found himself lying on the couch, the TV still on. He couldn't remember what had happened, but he knew that something was very wrong. He went to the library and began to research the history of his apartment. He discovered that it had once been the site of a terrible crime. A man had killed his family and then killed himself, and their spirits were said to haunt the building. John knew that he had to get rid of the TV and break the curse. He contacted a priest who specialized in exorcisms and asked for his help. The priest performed a ritual that involved holy water and prayer. The TV flickered and then went black. John felt a sense of relief wash over him. He knew that the curse had been broken and the spirits had been put to rest. When all of a sudden, the priest was lifted into the air as if being choked by an invisible force. John tried to help, but the force was too strong. After the priest ceased to move, his body was flung across the room. Blood splattered across the wall as his head bashed against it. In shock, John was frozen as the faceless figure materialized before him. The figure reached for John and grumbled, "Now you will never be free." Story 3: The Haunted Basement. Amy was home alone watching TV when she heard a strange noise coming from the basement. It sounded like someone was walking around down there, but she knew that she was the only one in the house. Amy tried to ignore the noise, but it grew louder and more insistent. She finally got up and went to investigate, grabbing a flashlight on the way. As she descended the stairs, Amy felt a chill run down her spine. It was dark and musty down there, and she felt like she was being watched. Suddenly, the flashlight went out, leaving Amy in complete darkness. She heard a creaking noise and felt something brush against her leg. She screamed and ran back up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind her. Amy couldn't shake the feeling that something was down there, something evil. She went to her neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, and asked for her help. Mrs. Jenkins was an expert on the paranormal and had dealt with ghosts and spirits before, as she happened to be a Yoruba priestess. She listened carefully to Amy's story and nodded. "It sounds like your basement is haunted," she said. "There's a vengeful spirit down there, and it's trying to make contact with you." Amy didn't know what to do. She was terrified, but she didn't want to leave her home. Mrs. Jenkins suggested that they perform a ritual to try to contact the spirit and learn its story. They went down to the basement together and lit candles. Mrs. Jenkins began to chant, and Amy felt a sense of energy growing stronger around them. Suddenly, a figure materialized in front of them. It was a young girl dressed in old-fashioned clothes. She looked sad and lost, and Amy could sense her pain. The girl began to speak, telling them her story. She had been a slave in the 1800s, and her master had abused and tortured her. She had died in the basement, and her spirit had been trapped there ever since. Amy and Mrs. Jenkins knew that they had to help the girl find peace. They contacted a historian who specialized in slavery and worked to uncover the truth about the girl's life. With the historian's help, they were able to document the girl's story and bring her the justice she deserved. The house had been in Amy's family for generations and had belonged to her great-great-grandfather. The vengeful spirit was put to rest, and Amy felt a sense of peace and closure. Or so she thought. As Amy ascended upstairs with a sense of peace, suddenly the basement door slammed shut. Mrs. Jenkins watched in horror as Amy rose up the wall, unable to breathe. Just before Amy lost her consciousness, she was released and began violently tumbling down the stairs. Barely living, Amy felt something grab her arm as she was dragged across the basement floor. She felt a force swing her into a compartment. When she looked up, the furnace door was closed before her eyes. Mrs. Jenkins ran over to try and pry the door open as she chanted powerful incantations. But it was too late. The furnace began to heat up, and the screams of Amy echoed in the basement as Mrs. Jenkins watched in horror